welcome back to another episode of Tech Pro Unicorn Podcast. I am your host, Michael Grace, and today I am joined by a guest who's going to talk to us about reading and how that helps in leadership. So today I'm joined by Danny Brassell. Danny is a highly sought after speaker, trainer, and coach known as the Jim Carrey with a PhD. I love that. Dr. Brassell has spoken to over 3,000 audiences worldwide, authored 16 books. I think that's a podcast record. I don't think we've had anyone have 16 books, including his latest, Leadership Begins with Motivation. He's the co-founder of thereadinghabit.com, the world's top reading engagement program. And at the end, we'll point you to a website where Dr. Brassell is going to offer you some gifts for participating in the podcast. So, Dr. Brassell, thank you very much for joining us here on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael, and thanks for bloating my head. Don't be too impressed with 16 books. I learned a great tip from Ken Blanchard, who he's actually in your neck of the woods in the Phoenix area. He gave a ton of money to Grand Canyon University, but he once said in a presentation, why write one 800-page book when you could write 8 100-page books? And I always remembered that because I'm like, people will read 100-page books more than they will read 800-page books. So that's the quick tip for the audience there.
I love it. That is a great tip. Reading, it's such a it's a basic skill. It's something we all are taught. All the way back to the reading, writing, and arithmetic kind of. We can trace our history and education all the way back, and we keep focusing on reading, and there's all these supplemental programs in schools on reading, and there's so much focus on people being able to read, obviously, as a way to gain knowledge. You've kind of made your whole career around reading. Talk to us a little bit about your journey. How'd you come to focus on reading?
Well, that's a great question, Michael. I mean, it's ironic. I'm considered America's leading reading ambassador, which cracks up my parents because I grew up hating reading. My father was a librarian. I always hated the public library. It always had uncomfortable furniture that always smelt funny to me. There was always some elderly woman telling me to be quiet. There's always some freaky homeless guy thinks he's a vampire hanging out by the bookshelves. I always hated it. And it wasn't until I started teaching in the inner city in South Central Los Angeles where I saw a lot of my students didn't have the advantages I had growing up. I mean, my family wasn't poor. We always had enough food to eat every single day, but we were not wealthy by any means. But I had both parents in my home. My parents always read to us kids. They read in front of us. We had plenty of access to reading materials. And I said, shame on me, Michael, because I realized a lot of kids don't have those opportunities. And you and I were having a brief conversation before the podcast where we were talking about your type of reading. And I think schools do an adequate job of teaching kids how to read. But the question I always ask people is, what good is it teaching a kid how to read if they never want to read? I teach kids why to read because I've never had to tell a kid, go watch TV. I've never had to tell a kid, go play a video game. And I never want to have to tell a kid, go read a book. I want them to choose to do it because they enjoy it. And what you were sharing with me earlier is that you often don't find time for reading because the type of reading you're doing is like technical. And it's a lot like everybody in your audience. We have so much. I mean, it cracks me up when people say we're in an illiterate society. I'm like, you're kidding me. We are in a highly literate society. I was with a fourth grader a couple of months ago, and his teacher's like, oh, he doesn't know how to read. Michael, in 1 hour, this boy texted about 20 people. He sent several emails. He surfed the web. He's highly literate. She's using a definition of literacy from 100 years ago. And I always emphasize this to people, adults just like kids. I'm like, the research is very clear on this. It doesn't matter what you read. What matters is how much you read. It doesn't matter if you're reading James Joyce or James and the Giant Peach. People who read more read better. And so I get annoyed when they don't think technical reading is actual reading, or they don't think reading news headlines and things on their iPhone is reading. Reading does not have to be confined to Dostoevsky Russian novels. It can be something, we have this leadership audience. I mean, people that have influenced me are people like John Maxwell and Jack Canfield. These are people, their books they have all kinds of cool stories. And I don't even necessarily read a full book. I think that's one of the silly things in America too. We're taught to finish what we start. And I'm like, well, that's stupid. I mean, think of reading like a piece of food. If you eat something, you're like, oh, that's nasty. Well, maybe it gets better. Oh, no, it's nasty. I mean, same thing with a book. If you don't like the first chapter, you're probably not going to like the second chapter. Put it down. Get something else. There's over 4 million books written in English alone last year. Some of them are pretty good. Don't waste your time with nonsense. And you don't have to read the full book. I mean, sometimes I just read for I love stories, anecdotes. And I'll read a book just for one anecdote. The book I just read it was a 350-page book, but it had one anecdote, which I was like, wonderful, worth the read just for that anecdote. And so I want the audience to first of all, I'm forgiving you for thinking that you don't read, because you are reading. Let's expand that definition of literacy. And really what I'm trying to do is show people fun ways to incorporate reading throughout their day. Long answer to a short question, Michael.
No, I love it. I love it. The focus to getting them of how to read, which is the mechanics I think we teach in our education system, to the want to read, the desire, the passion. I love what you said about video games or YouTube or social media. It just, kind of made my head explode because it's spot on. We don't ever, we're trying to curtail that. We're trying to pull them back from that and transfer them back to reading or doing homework or doing math or other things. So unlocking that secret around how do we get them passionate about reading or doing math or the things that build those life skills.
And let me ask you a question, Michael. When was the last time somebody at work asked you to read a novel?
Not very often. Probably never.
Yeah. So why do we just disparage people that are doing technical reading? I mean, I like reading novels, but I guarantee you, I'm one of these people that has 12 o'clock flashing on my DVD player because I can't read the instructions on the technical manual or whatever. That's a very good type of, and I'm like, I try to get people thinking about reading, and you shouldn't just read one thing. I mean, all of us have something. I love reading biographies. I love leadership books, personal development, but I make sure to read poetry every now and then just to keep myself up on poetry. I have 3 kids, and so I have a book for each kid that we're reading, and they have very different interests. My wife has a completely different interest. I just read this book of 5 in a series that was wonderful. And this is what I encourage the audience to do. I mean, we were talking about your son working at Facebook. I'm sure he might have a lot more interest in reading, maybe like Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, since she was at Facebook. Maybe he has more interest in reading that than reading, I don't know, any novel that's out there. I mean, when I taught second grade, I had a little boy, Kiara, and Kiara's first grade teacher told me, Kiara don't know nothing. I'm like, well, thank you for that. Well, Kiara, who didn't know nothing, comes into my classroom one day and he's like, hey, Mr. Brassell, you see Barkley last night? He had 18 points, 16 boards. I'm like, thank you, Kiara. Because from that point on, after lunch every day, I'd sit him on my lap and we read the LA Times sports page. And I'll tell you what, Michael, end of the year, one of my best readers, and all that kid ever read about was sports. Now, do I think he has to expand his reading? Yeah, but I mean, this is one of the tips I give to parents. The little boy who only reads Captain Underpants is going to become a better reader than the little boy who refuses to read anything. Captain Underpants is the gateway drug to Shakespeare. We got to get them hooked first. You got to figure out what's it going to take to get them hooked. So this is the tip to everybody out there. Figure out what your kid's interested in or what you're interested in, and just set aside. I mean, I love this tool. This iPhone is the greatest thing ever because I can set little reminders every day. Oh, I'm gonna read for 10 minutes right now. This is my peaceful time. Some people that, I'm one of these people, I'm always impressed with people that can memorize scripture. I've never been able to do that. And so what I did is I started setting some alerts. So like I wanted to learn James chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. So every day at 1:23, I have an update to memorize that little piece. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Wow, I'm impressed. I learned that. the movie Dune came out, and Dune was one of those few books that when I was a kid, I actually enjoyed reading Dune. And there's a great monologue that the main character, Paul Atreides, tells himself in Dune called The Litany Against Fear. And so I set myself a reminder every day at 9/11, because this is emergency. So it's like, I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I mean, I learned that from doing that. And so that's a quick tip for everybody out there. I mean, make reading a priority by setting yourself little reminders on your iPhone. Like, and you don't have to spend 20 minutes. You can spend 3 minutes. I mean, 3 minutes is better than nothing. 5 minutes is better than three. That's just something I've learned in math. So it doesn't have to be a big deal. And I mean, comic books, that's one of the best ways. You know, I do corporate trainings. It always cracks me up. All these people that are saying the education system, we need to get higher level learning. I was just doing a corporate training last week. You know, all these men and women dressed up in their suits, looking stone-faced. And I asked them, well, what was your favorite book growing up? Michael, 70% of the audience is like Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Batman. Comic books count. You know, my dad is the most intelligent person I ever met in my life, and that's how he learned about the classics. He used to read classic comics. He didn't want to read Pride and Prejudice, so he got the comic book on Pride and Prejudice. Today, there's all kinds of graphic novels. There was a great graphic novel on the 9/11 Commission report that I was just fascinated by. I'm like, wow, the report's really boring. The graphic novel's really cool. So that was interesting to me. I just think we have to expand that definition. And again, long answer to a short question, and I actually misdirected myself. But I get
no, it's great. You hit a topic that I talk a lot about. Being a content creator, right? So I create a podcast. I write lots of blog articles. I'm published in a lot of magazines. You know, I'm writing a book right now. My wife and I have a YouTube channel that's monetized. I'm all over content creation, right? And it's all related because to me, one inspires the other. So you might go see the movie Dune and be like, oh, that was the greatest movie of all time. And I'll use a personal example. I read the book Ready Player One, right? And I could not wait for that movie to come out. And then I read Ready Player Two. And, you know, and then I'm still waiting, you know, hopefully they're in production, but I'm waiting for the movie to come out. Right. But it could have very well been, I went and saw the movie and, you know, wanted to read the book. Great book, by the way, Ready Player One, Ready Player Two.
And that's great, Michael. I love that you do that. It's actually a tip. A lot of people in schools say, don't do that. I'm like, why not? Because I always hear kids. This is what I love, getting them to watch the movies because I know what they're going to say to me. They're like, wow, the movie was really good, but the book's a lot better because all of us picture settings and characters in our own point of view. And so, I mean, it was interesting because I taught predominantly Latino American and African American students. And so, like, the main character in Ready Player One, they're sitting there, and their point of view was they thought of an African American main character or a Latino main character. I'm like, what? And that's why I thought Lin-Manuel Miranda did society a huge favor with Hamilton. It's like, why don't we just imagine the founding fathers as minorities? And I'm like, if you watch Hamilton, after a couple of minutes, you forget that Hamilton wasn't Hispanic. I mean, it's amazing, and I love that. I think that's great.
Yeah. It's you know, whatever gets the imagination and the brain firing, right? At the end of the day, I love when I see people read something and then come to me and they'll have ideas, right? They'll be like, or somebody will say, hey, you wrote this piece, and then they'll challenge me on it, right? Which is awesome.
Yeah.
I'm like, wow, okay, you read something or you listen to my podcast. I can't tell you the number of people. I have to be careful now because, you know, when we go into a client, right, this is only related to what I really do, right, which is consulting for really large corporate America. And I'll go in there consulting, and the first thing they say now is, hey, I watched your podcast on blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's very cool, right? Or they read a blog post or whatever. And it just allows us a common area to engage upon, right? Like book clubs. If you think about book clubs, everybody reads something and then they're having opinions and conversations about what they read. It creates this sense of community around a common item, right? We're able to read, and anyone can read the same thing, and then you just have this great discussion around and to your point, everybody interprets it maybe a little bit differently.
Absolutely. I mean, people love stories, Michael. You're so right about that. I mean, it was Stalin, of all people, who said 1,000,000 people dead is a statistic. One person dead, is a tragedy, because we lock into that. President Reagan, I think, was the first president. You'll notice this. It's State of the Union address. Every president since Reagan has done this. Rather than explaining, we'll take, for example, healthcare. Presidents used to try to explain something amorphous like healthcare. President Reagan was very smart about this. He'd say, we got Tom Patterson from Louisville, Kentucky, up in the gallery. Tom, stand up for everybody. Here, I can do a Reagan and Will. Tom was up, and he's like, Tom works for GM, and GM doesn't pay his health care, and so now he has to spend $450 out of pocket every month. I mean, it put a human face on it. This isn't political, by the way. I don't care about it. Because my best investment of the last year is I bought a spray bottle. When people talk to me about politics, I just spray them in the face. I'm like, I have no time for that. I'm into solutions, not to griping.
Yes.
But when you put a story to it, I mean, one of the things I do is I travel around the country. There's executives that are trying to create their speech. And so I'll fly out for 2 days. And for 2 days, me and the executive will walk basically a half a marathon a day. We'll have sushi. We'll talk. I'll record everything they're saying, and we'll structure their signature talk from those 2 days. And then if they want, we can also structure a book from it. I mean, and that's where you're brilliant, Michael, is that you've learned this whole multimedia facet. It's kind of like, how do you attack a small country? By land, by air, by sea. How do you get people to learn your message? Well, you make it so they can hear it, you make it so they can see it, and then you make a physical copy in a book so that they can read it. And I think that's so brilliant what you're doing. And you're right. Yeah, that's how and that's what you're teaching the audience all the time, is how to build out their expertise. And, it cracks me up. You're like, well, I just have this little podcast, but your podcast is being seen in Norway. You have no idea who's in your audience, who you're positively affecting. And I love that you have that global idea, because that's what I learned from the pandemic was, all of a sudden I was reaching people. I would do a podcast for somebody in Tallahassee, Florida, and then I'd go on live Nigerian television. I'm like, wow, I never thought I was going to go to Nigeria, but now I have an audience in Nigeria. It's fascinating to me.
It's so, we're blessed by all these media sources and ways for people to tell their story, to get their message out, and to hopefully improve the lives of others, right? When I saw this topic, I was like, it's such an important topic. I have a granddaughter, and we have all kinds of, Goodnight Moon and all kinds of really cool kids books that my own kids now are older. And I so miss those moments where we would just sit in the nursery or in their rooms, and they'd jump up on my lap and we'd read a book. And I was like, man, those moments are coming back, and I'm getting them with my granddaughter, and they're just like, I think from a parent perspective, they're so powerful, right? Just that quiet time with books, with words.
Yeah, I agree, Michael. Amen. I'm a Baptist in your front row. I mean, we need more of those times together. That's where people, I used to work at a preschool, and I found some kids entered at a very low level and some kids entered at a much higher level. And that's where your gap is. It's before the kids ever entered school. And the kids that were entering at a high level, they were being read aloud to all the time by their parents or their grandparents. I talked to tens of thousands of people about how did you learn how to read. And I've never had a person say, oh, Danny, the way I learned how to read, my grandma, Nana, she had this rocking chair, and she'd sit me on her lap, and we'd rock back and forth, and she'd open up that book, smile at me, point at the words, and say, alligator, ball. No, I've never heard somebody say that's how they learned how to read. It's because they had an enjoyable experience. And isn't it sad that as school progresses, reading becomes a drag rather than fun? I mean, I was a basketball player, and I love playing basketball. I didn't like doing drills and practice all the time. And unfortunately, that's what reading is in a lot of schools. It's a lot of drills, a lot of forced reading. This is something you're supposed to read. I'm like, well, what makes this book any more important than this book? I mean, in high school, I had a high school English teacher that made me read The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And no offense to the people that love Scarlet Letter, but the book is about Hester Prynne, who commits adultery, so she's forced to wear an A on her chest. And I asked my teacher, I said, can I wear a B on my chest? Because this is the most boring thing I've ever read in my life. And that's what got me hating reading, is people saying, oh, you've got to read this, where, if a person just said, oh, here, Danny, here's a book on the Denver Broncos, you have to read it. I'm like, heck yeah, that's great. I want to read that. Or here's a biography on President Teddy Roosevelt. I'm like, oh yeah, that's really cool. But if you're saying, oh, here's an 18th century British romance with all female characters, I'm like, oh, can you just pull the nails out of my fingers right now? It was horrible, and that's what got me to hate reading. It doesn't have to be that way. And that's something I'm always preaching to the experts too. I'm like, there's no research that shows that what you read. Well, I mean, excuse me, I shouldn't say that. I mean, it's one of the reasons I stopped watching the news, because it's feeding me with negative stuff. I believe you are what you read, so read good stuff. I mean, I have one of the top book clubs online, lazyreaders.com. If any of your listeners are listening, they can subscribe. It's a free subscription. Once a month for the rest of your life, I update it with 10 book recommendations, 3 or 4 adult level, 3 or 4 young adult level, and 3 or 4 children's level books, all under 250 pages, so you can read something when you're stuck in a boring meeting. And the whole point is just to get people excited about reading. The more excited you are to read, the more likely you are to read. And the more you read, the better you get. We just make this stuff way too complicated, and it's a shame. It doesn't have to be that way.
I love it. Your forced reading analogy just brought back, like, I had PTSD.
What was the book that killed you?
Beowulf, right?
Horrible.
And it was, and I love this English teacher, right? She was fantastic. I really enjoyed her, senior English teacher. But she was so passionate around Beowulf. And I read it and I was like, okay, great. And we literally were on Beowulf for what seemed like my entire senior year. We were stuck on Beowulf. And I was like, it wasn't that great of a book. It wasn't that long. It wasn't like, here's what happened. Why are we still belaboring this damn poem, right? Like,
I agree.
I don't understand, right? Like, to me, right, and I get the challenge of doing this. To me, it almost seems like we should let students like follow their track, right? Follow what they're passionate about reading. And I get the complexity when you have overcrowded schools and 50 kids and stuff per teacher. A teacher can't be like, okay, everyone's reading 50 different things, and now the burden to follow along with them is on me, the single teacher following 50 different tracks. I totally understand that. But I love something. I mean, I'm still stuck on this conversion from getting them to want to read, and let them read what they want, what they're passionate about, what their personal interest is. And then they're reading and they're enjoying it and they're excited, and it just launches them.
Well, and there's something you just said, Michael, which I address all the time when I'm training teachers. I'm like, anybody can teach. Teaching's really easy. Being a good teacher is hard. And yeah, it's a lot tougher if all the kids are reading something different. But the school wasn't built for me as the teacher. The school was built for the kids. I'm looking at people like your son, and I'm thinking, why am I making this kid read Beowulf when I can say, here's what I want you to do. I want you to create a website or a video game or something. And I guarantee you, your kid is going to read so much more. I mean, I'm always looking at, what's my objective? Is my objective to make him proficient in Beowulf, or to make him a passionate reader, somebody that's good at reading? And that's what we have to look at that. And too many people, they ignore that objective. I'm always looking at the objective, and I'm kind of just, well, I'll give you an example. When I was in high school, same teacher that made me read Scarlet Letter, she made us memorize 200 lines of Shakespeare. So, Michael, I'm an obnoxious kid. And so I raised my hand and I asked, well, do they have to be consecutive lines? And she interpreted the question as, oh, no, you can learn like 100 lines from this monologue and 100 lines from this monologue. That's not what I was looking at. I was looking at the shortcut. And so what I did is I learned about 4 or 5 lines from all 37 of Shakespeare's plays. And so I got up there. I'm like, oh, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore out there, Romeo, to be or not to be? When shall we three meet again in thunder, lightning, or rain? Friends, Romans, countrymen. And here's to her credit. This is why, even though she was a tough teacher, I loved her, because she laughed. She's like, I've been doing this for 25 years. Never have I had anybody clever like that. And she asked me to do it again for her other classes. And I'm like, that's a good teacher. What a good teacher does, it's what a good coach does. I'm a huge sports fan. So we'll take like a guy like Bill Belichick. And the thing I love about Bill Belichick, the football coach, is he looks at the team he has and he caters his plan based around the strengths of his team. When he lost Tom Brady, he realized, okay, I don't have the same passing game, so I need to really focus on my defense, and I need my quarterback is young, so I need to make sure he's throwing shorter passes to make him successful and handing the ball off. And with a team that was definitely inferior from his Tom Brady-led team, he took them to the playoffs, and people were criticizing him like, look at what he just got. And he was missing like half of his players because of COVID. I'm like, you are not looking at what this guy's done. And that's what I love that. I'm always looking at the teacher. Anybody, it's like playing poker. Anybody can change their cards. The true leader is the leader that takes the cards that they're dealt and turns it into a winning hand. And that's the person I'm looking for.
I love, whenever we get these inspiring stories, whenever we hear of a teacher that changed somebody's life, they're in such a position to be able to do that. And I get they're overworked, underpaid. I get the problems with our educational system. But I remember I was just in general, I had just gotten out of high school, gone to college, and I was like, I think I want to go into business. I don't really know. And at a community college, right, I had this college professor who was so excited about business, right? He was just like, oh, and this is what you can do. And he just blew up my world, right? I was like, business is amazing, right? And then I just jumped wholeheartedly in, like, and never had words with him to say, you totally changed my trajectory, right? But they have that ability.
For you, Michael, is I want you to seek out that person and write them a letter and just say thank you, because that's what too many of us forget. I used to do that with all my teachers. I'm like, hey, that teacher that made an impact, I did it once, and this woman sent me this incredible letter. She's like, I've been teaching for 35 years and I was about to quit. And then my student wrote me this letter. And I'm like, and that's all of us, right? I mean, you're talking to leaders out here, and all of us. What I love that you're emphasizing is, are we leading a life of significance? Are we having a meaningful impact? All of us have that opportunity every single day. So you keep on preaching that. That's great. And I love that. I mean, and that's what I'm constantly, we're losing too many great teachers. One of the things you'd said, I love watching those inspirational teaching movies, and I have yet to see that inspirational teaching movie where it's like he went to the inner city and he inspired his students by using the state's mandatory scripted reading program. I've never seen that movie, but it's the person that they bring passion to what they do, and that's what I always train teachers. I'm like, if you love Ohio State football, why don't you relate everything to Ohio State football? I mean, I guarantee you can teach math, social studies, science, and English with Ohio. I mean, because the kids are going to feel your passion. I had a teacher in 3rd grade, and she was into macrame, and all of us became interested in macrame because she related it to everything. And I'm like, that's exactly what you're saying. You have this one community college professor, and by the way, community college is the most underrated in the country. If it was up to me, I would tell people. I mean, I loved it. Tennessee. The governor passed and the legislature passed a law that anybody that graduates high school in Tennessee is guaranteed a free community college education. I don't know why every state doesn't do that, because there's no reason you should pay 80 grand a year at Harvard for your first 2 years of college to take the gen ed courses that you could get from a community college professor who was not hired based on their research, but based on their teaching ability. And that's that person that reaches a person like you, Michael, and sparked your interest. I mean, that's what teaching, I mean, that's what people are always like, why are you a teacher, Danny? What's your goal? My goal is one of my students wins the Nobel Peace Prize and cures cancer. And I totally believe that. I'm like, I'm going to have that impact. And I don't know why you do it if you don't have that impact.
Yeah, I love it. So reading and leadership. Let's talk a little bit about that, right? I always tell leaders, right? Leadership is hard. That's why you're a leader, right? It's not meant to be easy. It's not managing the status quo. It's being out in front, setting a path, creating a vision, and having the honor to lead people. Let's talk about reading and how reading feeds into that. For me, I mean, I know that I have to stay up, right? I have to stay up on all the industry stuff. Tech is changing every minute. Elon Musk is constantly, poking the bear, and I've got to figure out what he's doing with Twitter, because we use Twitter, and right. There's just all this stuff. So I'm constantly reading content. But how should leaders, or how could leaders, or how does leadership relate to reading?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michael. That's the $1 million question. I mean, I've read about plenty of readers that don't necessarily become effective leaders, but I've never studied an effective leader that's not an avid reader. I mean, you just gave the example of Elon Musk. I read his biography by Ashley Vance, which is a fascinating book. Have you read that one?
I have not. No.
Okay, so you don't have to read it because I already read it. I'll give you the two great stories from that. There are two great stories in that book. He's talking to his biographer. They're at a Mexican restaurant having chips and salsa and margaritas. And Elon Musk, he has a new girlfriend, and he asks his biographer, I'm thinking about allocating 8.5 hours a week to her. Is that enough time? I'm like, wow, he manages his girlfriend the same way, his schedule. I thought that was fascinating. That's a great time management tip to people. I have a friend that's a time management expert, and I always give him a hard time. I'm like, actually, there's no such thing as time management. There's only priority management. I was reading research from 100 years ago, and I found out that people 100 years ago only had 24 hours in their day also. It's not the part of your day, it's how you use them. But then the other story in that was fascinating was at SpaceX, he was starting to annoy the engineers because he'd ask them questions on the floor, and these guys are like, man, I already got the job. Why is he interviewing me again? But then they started noticing the questions were getting more sophisticated, and they started comparing notes with one another. They're like, wait a second. Every time we give him an answer, he's learning, and he's learned it better than I understand it now. Like, that's how quickly he was assimilating it. And he was bullied as a kid, and he spent all of his time in the library and the bookstore. He actually read every book in the library and at the bookstore. And even today, while running $4 billion companies, he reads a book a day. Warren Buffett, one of the richest men in the world, he spends all his time at the office reading. You see it in politicians. President Teddy Roosevelt read 3 books a day while he was president. Pretty amazing. A lot of people forget that it was President Kennedy that when he was president, he was at a press conference, and a reporter asked him, well, what are you reading? He's like, oh, I'm reading this cool spy novel about this guy named James Bond. That comment got Hollywood to buy the rights to James Bond, and that's why we have the James Bond movies, was because of President Kennedy. Wow. You see it, athletes, like Bill Belichick has the world's largest professional American football book collection. He actually donated it to, I think, either the Naval Academy, or I can't remember where he went to school. He played lacrosse in college. LeBron James, when the Miami Heat were playing in their first finals, they cut into the locker room and they showed LeBron James reading Suzanne Collins' The Hunger Games. And I could have kissed the man, because I'm like, you just did more for literacy than I ever can, because a lot of kids are watching you. Generals in the military, General Schwarzkopf, they say could read in 4 languages, and he could quote Shakespeare voraciously. I mean, so These are all people in all different walks, all fields. I mean, show me a successful surgeon that's not reading all the time, staying on top of it. It's one of the silly things with the pandemic. I love how all of a sudden everybody became infectious disease experts. I'm like, I really don't know anything about it. So rather than listening to my Uncle Fred, I might actually listen to the person that has like 3 medical degrees on infectious disease. I'm just assuming they know more than me. You know, just like in business leadership, you know, who am I going to listen to? A person that owns a McDonald's or a person who's been to a McDonald's? I'm like, well, these are 2 different points of view. I mean, and I'm not going to disparage the person that's been to a McDonald's, but you don't understand all the intricacies behind running a company. Everybody seems, you know, the older I get, I love that quote by John Wooden, the basketball coach. He said, it's the things you learn after you know it all that make the biggest difference. And as I get older, I realize I really don't know that much. And that's why I love reading more than anything, is I'm trying to, like reading Ashley Vance's biography on Elon Musk. I want to figure out what was it that got him in. And again, I tell people, you know, you might not read the whole thing. Here's a good tip for your audience is if you want to sound intelligent, I'll go to Barnes and Noble all the time before a party. I'll go to the children's section and I'll find 32-page children's picture biographies on Jeff Bezos and Carlos Slim, and I read and learn a little bit about them. And every now and then, they kind of fascinate me to the point where I'm like, okay, I'll read something a little bit trickier on this person. I mean, Jackie Robinson was like that for me. I felt bad that I didn't know a lot about Jackie Robinson, so I read a kid's book on him. I was like, wow, this guy's pretty interesting. So then I read a young adult book on him. I've now read like 9 books on Jackie Robinson, and wow. I tell people I don't think Martin Luther King even happens without Jackie Robinson. This guy was a trailblazer. I mean, we give him a lot of credit, but I don't think he actually receives as much civil rights credit as he really deserves. He was pretty fascinating. Wow. And then one of the books I just read was a football book on the first African-American football players in modern football. And so the first African-American football player was a guy by the name of Kenny Washington, who played on UCLA's team, and the guy that played next to him was Jackie Robinson. And even though I'm a USC grad, I'm like, isn't that amazing that UCLA got both the first African-American baseball player and the first African-American football player? Fascinating stuff. This is why I read, and this is why leaders read. I mean, this guy in Ukraine I'd never even heard of. And I'm like, I'm dying to read something about this guy. I'm like, this guy should run for president of the United States. You talk about a leader. This guy's right in the pits with everybody else. I mean, this is amazing. So I'm constantly fascinated. And that's what I think is the most important key to being a good leader, is to being curious about people and better systems.
Yeah, I love it. I use reading to inspire a lot too. So if I'm going to go on stage, do a presentation, talk about some tech subject, right, and bring tech knowledge, or even companies, and I'm kicking off a big engagement that we're doing. I'm researching the company. I'm researching the people that are there, like you, right? Like what's written about them, what's their history, even if that reading is LinkedIn profiles, right? Oftentimes I learn so much on a LinkedIn profile. I'm like, man, I legitimately want to create a relationship with this person and learn more about what they're doing here, right? But I wouldn't get that if I didn't read, right? So to me, reading can even be, I think we just stereotype reading as in what you said earlier, cover to cover reading of some 500-page. I can't tell you, Ready Player 2 was probably the last book that I read cover to cover. And most of my reading, and I read every single day for probably several hours a day, but it's usually like I'm researching something. Okay, I've read enough about that, made some notes, and I move on, right? And I think we discount that kind of reading. Oftentimes when my kids started their high school and their college journeys, I have 2 kids in college right now, they used to get these silly, like, read this generic story, these like 8 paragraphs, and highlight the journey of the main character and blah blah blah. And they could tell me, right? They read it, they didn't really comprehend it, but then they could tell me certain things about it, right? They could talk about it, and I used to just be like, okay, like, then talk about what you did get out of it, right? Like, tell that story. Forget the question, and their teachers would be like, well, they didn't answer their question. I'm like, well, it was a stupid assignment to begin with, right? Like, to what point is this? They obviously read the story because they told something about it, but they got something other than what you wanted. And luckily my kids, graduated high school, did fine, are in great colleges. but teachers used to hate me because I just used to challenge that easy way out. Like everybody must do the same thing. It's like I don't know. So
I
that
love it, Michael. I mean, that's one of the. You have my vote for Secretary of Education. It's really the most important question I train students to ask is why. I mean, I've taught all age levels from high school. I always tell from preschoolers to rocket scientists. I started off as a secondary teacher teaching history. And the first thing I always taught students is, well, you have to understand that history books are usually written by the winners. I mean, every event in history has multiple points of view. And in this class, we're going to learn how to listen to different points of view. I don't care if you agree with the point of view. That's not my intention. I'm going to teach you how to think, not what to think. And that's what I love that you were doing that. These are the 3 words I train teachers to remember. Book reports stink. They get kids to hate reading. That's why I love Oprah. Oprah on her show doesn't say, oh, I just read this great book. It's called Their Eyes Were Watching God. Here's what I want you to do at home. I want you to get a piece of paper and a pen. I'd like you to write down the 3 main characters, the theme, the copyright date. I mean, when was the last time you went to the movie theater, you saw like some Marvel superhero movie, and your first instinct was to rush out to your car, get an old napkin and a pen from the glove compartment, rush back into the lobby and say, hey, anybody know the theme of that movie? What was the theme of that movie? Why can't you just enjoy it and have a lively discussion about, well, what were the points that you enjoyed about it? I get very annoyed when people are like, this is what the author was thinking. I'm like, how do you know that? I know plenty of people that thought Kurt Vonnegut meant this in this book, and Kurt Vonnegut's like, that's totally wrong. That's not at all. This was an anti-war protest book. Like, it cracks me up. I'm like, unless you're in that person's mind, and even I'm in a men's Bible study, and the thing I like the most about it is you can get 20 men reading the same piece of scripture, and all of us have different points of view. And often I'm like, wow, I never considered that. That's an interesting point of view. I mean, sometimes people change my point of view. We'd be much better served in society if people were willing to shut up and listen every now and then. Again, you don't have to agree with people, but you should listen to people and try to consider their point of view.
I love it. Earlier on, you used an example from LeBron James of just him holding a book and how powerful that was. And we talked about Elon Musk. So I tell all my guests, right, I cyberstalk you a little bit so we can have good discussions. And the other one that you have on here on your website is Pitbull. Which, is he's an amazing artist. He has his own channel on Sirius XM that I might listen to way too much and drive my wife crazy, but my kids think it's cool. So, yeah. Fireball, I don't know. Anyway, so what about Pitbull has what does he have in common with LeBron and Elon?
Well, so again, that's what we were talking earlier about different types of reading. And so I got a lot, so I taught in the inner city, and a lot of my middle schoolers, they wouldn't be interested in reading at all. I'm like, well, do you know this hip hop song? And they'd know it. I'm like, didn't they have to write that? They're like, yeah. I'm like, well, why don't we look at the lyrics? This is still legitimate reading. Matter of fact, I mean, my son's a big Metallica fan. And so I was reading the lyrics to the Black Album. The song Nothing Else Matters is just pure poetry. I'm looking at this, James Hetfield. I'm like, this is beautiful. And actually, I showed my son an interview with Elton John with James Hetfield, the lead singer of Metallica. And Elton John's like, this is the freaking most beautiful song I've ever read in my life. And you see James Hetfield like, oh my gosh, Elton John just told me. I mean, this is a totally different genre. But then you get like a guy like Pitbull who's like, oh, I studied, I love the way that Mozart would put together things in threes. And I'm like, Pitbull and Mozart in the same sentence? That cracks me up. But see, I don't care what your field is. You learn from, and this is why I love leading masterminds, is I want to be around people that are in totally different fields. Maybe this guy's in real estate, but he has this really cool marketing concept that this other guy who's an accountant can use in being a better accountant. I mean, that's why you want to surround. I love being around people that know. I don't want to be the smartest person in the room. I'm in the wrong room then. I need to be around people that I'm like, wow, that's really interesting. One of the ways, when I was teaching middle school, Michael, I was the first teacher at my school not to have a single student tardy. And the reason was because I always started off class, I'd read aloud a 5-minute Paul Harvey story. I grew up listening to Paul Harvey on the radio. He passed away a couple of years ago at the age of 325 years old. And Paul Harvey would come on the radio every day at 12:15 where I lived. He'd say, like, I'm Paul Harvey with the rest of the story. And there's all these great books he wrote that are still on Amazon. They're used, but you can buy copies of them. Each of them has like 101 rest of the stories. And they were just gold because I was all my students were the same as me. They're trying to figure out who's he talking about. And then, but a lot of his stories, because Paul was alive a long time ago. And so like he'll talk about the founders of Sears Roebuck. Mm-hmm. Kids today, they don't know who Sears or Roebuck are, or JCPenney or any of these things. And so the last book that I wrote, this one's called Leadership Begins with Motivation. And this was like basically my homage to Paul Harvey was I was trying to figure out some stories that the kids today could relate to. Can I just give you a real quick one, Michael?
Yeah, absolutely.
That I think your listeners will enjoy. On the morning of January 17th, 1977, Gary Gilmore, in a plain T-shirt, strapped into a chair with a bag over his head, awaited a firing squad of 5 law enforcement officers to execute him at the state prison in Draper, Utah. Convicted of murdering a gas station employee and motel manager in Utah the year before, Gilmore would be the first person in the United States to be executed in nearly a decade. Shortly before his execution, prison officials asked Gilmore if he had any last words. Neither he nor anyone else that day would know the impact of those words. Over 10 years later, in 1988, Dan Whedon, an advertising executive who co-founded the Whedon and Kennedy Agency in Portland, Oregon, made something of a morbid pitch to a struggling fashion company. He recalled the inmate's final words and used a slight variation for his pitch, and seemingly everyone hated his idea for the company's new slogan. Just trust me on this one, Whedon implored the company's co-founder. And the co-founder, his company, and the public have not looked back since. The co-founder's name was Phil Knight. The struggling brand he co-founded was a shoe company called Nike. An advertising executive, Dan Whedon, slightly altered death row inmate Gary Gilmore's final words, "Let's do it," into the phrase, "Just do it." That's how you get people. I mean, it doesn't have to be 800 pages long. All I'm trying to do, I'm just so touched again, Michael, by what you were talking about, that community college professor. I'm like, wow, that's why you do this for a living. And that guy doesn't know he impacted you, but he impacted you just with his passion and his enthusiasm. I'm reading a book right now with my son. My son's into the Civil War. I'm like, well, you have to read The Killer Angels. So we're reading The Killer Angels together. If a high school teacher had given me The Killer Angels, Michael, I would have changed my major in college to history. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the book, it won the Pulitzer Prize in 1973. It was written by Michael Schirra, and it's about the Battle of Gettysburg. And I mean, it's an incredible book. I mean, the book is written from points of view of different generals and soldiers. And then it was great because after I read Seabiscuit with Laura Hillenbrand, I was reading up on Laura. And in an interview, she said, after reading The Killer Angels, I knew how I could write history in an exciting way. And that's why Seabiscuit's the same thing. It's written from different points of view. It's just fascinating. That's what reading should be, is getting people. And again, I always, with my students, I used to do book talks every Monday where I'd expose them to like 25 books from totally different genres. Cause I'm like, well, Loretta, she's into, she likes Southern fried cooking. Here's a great book about Paula Deen that'll get her interested in Southern fried cooking. Oh, and to Sean, he loves Walter Mosley, so I'm going to show him Always Outnumbered, Always Outgunned, because that's what he's interested. And Leroy loves the Los Angeles Lakers, so I'm going to show him, Showtime, which he'll love this book about the history of the Lakers. And that's what good parents, the same thing as a leader. Leaders, look at Phil Jackson when he was the coach of the Chicago Bulls. The reason he was the greatest, most successful NBA basketball coach in history was he identified every player and gave them a role. He made his 12th man feel just as important as Kobe Bryant or Michael Jordan, and he gave them different things to read. So he's got like Dennis Rodman. He needs him rebounding and staying focused all the time. So he gives him Sun Tzu's The Art of War to read. But this, Jordan, he wants Jordan to be more of a team player. So he's giving him a different type of book to consider his team.
Right.
I'm like, what a great leader. He's figuring out the strengths and weaknesses of every single player. He's figuring out, how do I get them to work together? Same thing if I'm leading a sales team. How do I get my sales force working together, where this person, even though they're always the top salesperson, this person feels bad about it. So how do I get this person to realize they need to mentor this person? Well, this is where reading comes in. How do we inspire? I mean, you have your personal anecdotes, yes, but this is where I love reading, is I can learn from people that I've never met Abraham Lincoln, and I never will, but I can learn from stories about Abraham Lincoln about, what were the things he did that made him such an effective leader?
I love it. I think we've effectively established, right? Reading is good, and it doesn't really matter what you need to read. You don't need to feel like, oh, I'm not reading cover to cover these huge novels in the library. The library to me is intimidating. I walk in there and I see all these books, and I go, "There's so much I don't know."
Yeah.
Right. And that's my reaction to a library. And it makes me want to read, but not these big books, right? It makes me want to get bits and pieces of knowledge that I can incorporate into what I use to hopefully inspire. I used to belong to. It was a great benefit. It was a benefit at a company that I can't remember which one of my previous employers had it, and it was essentially like book summaries, and you could go out and you could read any of the book summaries, right? And they had thousands. And I was like, oh my gosh, and that's how I read, 7 Secrets or whatever, 7, whatever. I was like, I don't want to read the whole damn book. Just tell me the 7. I'm an intelligent person. I'll understand what they are and I'll know how to use them. Thanks. Just give me the list.
What you're doing, because you just read that summary. Maybe that summary gets you so intrigued you read the book. So I tell people to do that all the time. Read those summaries. It's great. I love it.
I love it. Yeah, I just went out and looked at like a list. There's a list of 7 sites, that sell you a membership, but then for that membership, you get all these summaries, right? Absolutely. And to me, if you're investigating and reading little snippets, and to your point, and then you decide to go buy the author's book and read it, great. It's a win-win for everybody, right? If it inspires you to pick it up and read it, that's awesome. So you also have, we alluded to the site, which will be down below, which is freegiftfromdanny.com, which is very, very cool.
Yeah, that's as a thank you for everybody bearing with me and listening to me. If you go to freegiftfromdanny.com, I'm going to give everybody a complimentary e-copy of my book, Read, Lead, and Succeed, which is a book. I wrote it for a school principal who was trying to keep his faculty positively engaged. And so I said, okay, I'll write your book. So every week I give you a concept, an inspirational quote, an inspirational story, a book recommendation on a book you should read, but you're probably too lazy because you're an adult. So I also give you a children's picture book recommendation that demonstrates the same concept. You can read that in 5 minutes. And I tell people, don't discount the kids' literature. I mean, a lot of our best morals and lessons, maybe Congress should start reading kids' books about how to treat one another. And, there's a lot of wisdom that a lot of us poo-poo because it's written with pictures. I'm like, I love books with pictures. Why do we get rid of the pictures?
I love it. So that's going to be available out there on freegiftfromdanny.com. Link will be down below. I love how you break it up, right? And you spread it out so it's consumable. So even if you're busy, you're able to consume it. There's a cool video out on that site. I watched it to kind of get me all fired up. You're just amazing on stage. It's fun to watch. Yeah, it's fun to watch. To take reading and inspire people and get people excited is just, it's a gift. It's something that, I think we all understand the importance of reading, but to have somebody trying to inspire folks to do more of it, and to spread the word that don't get overwhelmed by, the Communist Manifesto. You don't necessarily have to read that. You can read much smaller chunks. So, Danny, thank you for taking the time and joining us here on the podcast.
Thanks for all you do, Michael. Continue spreading joy in the world. I really appreciate you and all that you're doing.
Awesome. Thank you.